The Ghostwriter, the Hollow Threshold. Prologue, the Oath of the Denarius. Subchapter 1, the Edge of the Known World. Britannia, in the year 70 AD, was not a jewel of the Roman Empire. It was a miserable, waterlogged punishment. To be stationed on the western fringes of the province, near the swelling, unpredictable banks of the River Severn, was to wage a daily war not just against the rebellious Celtic tribes, but against the very earth itself. Cassius, a centurion of the legions, stood at the edge of the muddy encampment and stared out into the grey, unforgiving mist. He was a man defined by the rigid, unyielding geometry of Roman discipline. He wore the heavy, segmented iron plates of his lorica segmentata over a thick wool tunic that was stiff with the morning's frost. On his head sat a heavy Galea helmet, its crimson crest a beacon of authority that demanded absolute obedience from the 80 men under his command. He was a career soldier, a man whose entire identity was forged in the fires of the auxiliary camps and the brutal discipline of the cohort. He did not possess lands in Italy. He did not have a wealthy patrician family waiting for him in the sun-drenched villas of Rome. He had only two things of absolute, undeniable value: his honour and the heavy, rectangular scutum shield that bore the fading red insignia and the crossed lightning bolts of his legion. And on this particular morning, he had his pay. Tucked securely into a small leather pouch beneath his iron breastplate was a newly minted silver denarius. It was his monthly wage. To a civilian, it was merely currency. But to Cassius, that small disc of stamped silver, bearing the profile of the Emperor Vespasian, was the physical manifestation of his worth. It was the Empire's acknowledgement of his blood, his sweat, and the years he had surrendered to the mud of this wretched island. It was proof that he was a Roman. It was his dignity cast in metal. The winter campaign had been exceptionally brutal. The ground had frozen, thawed, and frozen again, turning the landscape into a treacherous, sucking quagmire of black mud. Supplies were low, morale was fraying, and the damp cold seemed to actively hunt the warmth in a man's bones. Cassius had spent the morning drilling his men, driving them relentlessly, forcing them to maintain the shield wall until their muscles screamed, because he knew that in Britannia, indiscipline was a faster killer than any local chieftain's blade. As the pale afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the encampment, Cassius walked down toward the tributary stream that fed into the great River Severn. He needed to wash the grime from his hands and the dried blood from his knuckles. He moved with the heavy, calculated grace of a predator, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of his gladius shortsword. He did not know that he was taking the final steps of his mortal life. Subchapter 2, the Mud and the Dishonour. The banks of the stream were steep, undercut by the relentless flow of freezing, churning water. The ground was deceptive, a thin layer of frost masking a deep, unstable pit of slick, black clay. Cassius knelt by the water's edge, unbuckling the leather strap of his helmet. As he leaned forward to cup the freezing water in his hands, his calce slipped. A calce is a fully enclosed, laced leather boots or shoes that covered the entire foot. They provided much better warmth and protection against mud. It was a minor misstep, a fractional miscalculation of balance that a man of his agility should have easily corrected. But the mud was slick as oil. As Cassius threw his weight backward to compensate, the leather pouch beneath his armour caught against the sharp edge of his iron plating. The weakened stitching tore. Cassius heard the sound before he saw it, a sharp, metallic clink against the frost-hardened mud, followed by a soft, damning plop as the silver denarius broke the surface of the dark, rushing stream. For a fraction of a second, Cassius froze. His pay, his imperial seal, his honour. It was sinking into the muck of a barbarian river. Panic, a singular and entirely foreign emotion to the seasoned centurion, surged through his chest. He threw his helmet aside and lunged into the freezing water. The stream was only waist deep, but the cold was absolute, striking his nervous system like a physical blow. The water poured over the top of his greaves, soaking into his wool tunic, dragging him down with the accumulated weight of his armour. He plunged his bare hands into the black, churning mud at the riverbed, his fingers scrambling, sweeping frantically through the silt and sharp stones. "Where is it?" he grunted, the Latin words tearing from his throat in a cloud of white vapour. He dug deeper, the freezing water numbing his hands until he could no longer feel his own fingertips. The current pushed against him, threatening to topple his heavy frame. The cold began to seep past his skin, invading his muscles, slowing his frantic movements. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps, the winter air crystallizing in his lungs. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours. The sun vanished entirely, plunging the stream into a deep, freezing darkness. Cassius's men were calling for him from the ridge, their torches flickering in the distance, but he could not answer them. He could not return to the camp. How could a centurion, a man who demanded absolute perfection from his legionaries, return to the fires empty-handed? How could he admit that he had lost his imperial pay to a patch of mud? The shame of it was a fire in his mind that burned far hotter than the freezing water. He would rather die than face the dishonour of returning to his ancestors with nothing to show for his service. And so, he kept digging. He dug until his muscles locked, paralysed by the sub-zero temperatures. He dug until the black mud filled his fingernails and the rushing water breached his mouth. He dug until the cold finally stopped his heart, drowning him in the dark, desperate, terrified grip of absolute disgrace. Cassius died in the freezing mud. But because the crushing weight of his shame and the sheer, unadulterated terror of his dishonour were so profound, his soul refused to drift upward. His spirit latched onto the only thing that mattered, the heavy silver coin buried in the silt. The tether was forged. The purgatory had begun. Sub-Chapter 3, The Long Watch of the Frozen Isle. Time, to a ghost anchored by shame, is not a river, it is a stagnant pool. For the first few centuries, Cassius simply stood in the freezing spectral water, repeating his frantic, desperate search. He watched empires rise and fall through a haze of grief. He felt the heavy boots of Saxon kings marching over the earth above him. He felt the distant rumble of Norman stonemasons building great cathedrals to a god he did not recognize. As the centuries bled into millennia, the landscape shifted violently around his tether. The earth swallowed his coin deeper. The mighty tributary stream that had claimed his life was eventually tamed, diverted by Victorian engineers into dark, underground brick culverts beneath the expanding city of Gloucester. Cassius was pulled along with the spiritual gravity of the denarius, dragged upward from the deep earth until he found himself standing in a new, entirely alien world. He materialized in a landscape of blinding, artificial luminescence that assaulted his ancient optical nerves. The ground beneath his sandaled feet was not mud, but a perfectly smooth, scuffed white surface that smelled of harsh, chemical alchemy. The air hummed with a constant, low, vibrating drone that set his spectral teeth on edge. He was standing in the frozen food aisle of a Tesco Express. To the modern residents of Gloucester, it was just a convenience store on the high street. To Cassius, it was a localized, mocking manifestation of his freezing death. The air here was mechanically chilled by long rows of glowing, transparent ice boxes, perfectly replicating the biting cold of the winter campaign of 70 AD. For years, Cassius guarded this strange, brightly coloured territory. He stood at terrifying attention, his towering form glowing with a harsh, blindingly blue, icy light, completely invisible to the mortals who shuffled past him in their strange, soft clothing. He watched them load their woven metal baskets with brightly coloured parcels, entirely oblivious to the Roman warlords standing in their midst. He was trapped in a state of profound, eternal confusion. He spent his days aggressively poking at the strange, soft, freezing sacks of modern sustenance. He would stand before a massive icebox, his brow furrowed beneath his plumed helmet, using the razor-sharp tip of his gladius to repeatedly, furiously jab at a plastic bag of McCain crinkle-cut chips. He could not understand why his phantom steel blade passed harmlessly through the shiny packaging without spilling the strange, frozen yellow roots inside. It was a maddening, humiliating existence. He was a centurion of Rome, reduced to standing guard over frozen dough and chopped ice, unable to leave the proximity of the coin buried deep in the sewers beneath the linoleum. His pride, already fractured by his death, calcified into a wall of cold, unapproachable fury. He belonged to an empire of iron and blood, yet he was condemned to a brightly coloured purgatory of consumerist despair. He waited for an enemy he could fight. He waited for a commander who could relieve him. He waited for 1900 years. Sub-Chapter 4, The Girl in the Rain. The break in his eternal monotony arrived on a night when the Gloucester rain lashed violently against the glass doors of his brightly lit prison. Cassius felt the disruption in the atmosphere before he saw it. The sterile, freon-powered cold of his isle was suddenly invaded by a different kind of supernatural energy. The overhead lights flickered wildly, buzzing like angry hornets as an immense spiritual pressure entered his domain. He turned, raising his scutum shield, prepared to defend his territory. 4 figures approached. 3 were mortals. A young man dressed in a blindingly bright orange garment holding a glowing rectangular device, and a young woman in a dark, wet coat, and an older lady dress in a furry, wild leopard skin top and a leather pteruges, the distinctive dangling skirt seen on Roman military armour. It was made of overlapping strips of leather. To Cassius, she looked like an older Boudica. But the 4th was an anomaly. It was another spirit, a man dressed in bizarre, finely woven grey armour, radiating a soft, arrogant blue light. The new spirit floated closer, summoning small rings of glass to his eyes, inspecting Cassius with an infuriating lack of respect. The stranger circled him, muttering critiques about the wrinkles in Cassius's tunic and his posture. Then the stranger had the absolute audacity to speak. Salve, Miles, ego sum Silas Thorn, scripta et criticus. Cassius's mind snapped. The Latin was technically proficient, but it was spoken with the soft, mincing, musical cadence of a pampered patrician who had never held a sword, let alone marched through the mud of Britannia. It was an insult. With lethal, terrifying speed, Cassius whirled around. His gladius slashed through the freezing air in a perfect, blinding arc, passing cleanly through the arrogant spirit's neck. He banged his sword against his massive wooden shield, a deafening phantom clang that rattled the modern iceboxes, and screamed a string of violent, guttural camp slang, threatening to feed the stranger's entrails to the crows. His fury manifested physically. A localized flurry of spectral snow began to fall violently from the ceiling, dusting the frozen pizzas and the mortals below. But then the girl spoke. She did not run. She did not scream. She stood shivering in the supernatural blizzard, her teeth chattering, and demanded that the arrogant spirit translate. The stranger, suitably chastised, lowered his vocabulary to the harsh, blunt Latin of the military camps. Cassius paused. He lowered his sword a fraction of an inch. For the first time in nearly 2 millennia, someone was actually listening. Cassius pointed his sword at the girl, then jabbed the blade fiercely toward the linoleum floor. He spoke of his death. He spoke of the mud. He confessed his ultimate shame. The lost denarius, buried in the dark, subterranean waters beneath their very feet. He expected the mortals to walk away. Mortals cared only for themselves. They feared the dark, and they feared the damp. But the girl did not walk away. She listened to the translation, her dark eyes widening with understanding. She did not mock his failure. Instead, she dropped to her knees right there in the aisle, peering under the humming icebox, offering to scrape the dirt herself. When the stranger explained that the coin was deep in the sewers, Cassius expected her to abandon him. Why would a living woman risk the filth and the dark of the underworld for a forgotten soldier? Yet, against all logic, the girl and the boy left the brightly lit hall and descended into the earth. Cassius could feel them down there. Through the residual connection of his tether, he felt the mortal girl, Rhea, shivering on the slippery brick ledge of the Victorian culvert. He felt her plunging her bare, numb hands into the freezing, foul-smelling mud, scraping desperately through the silt and broken glass, enduring the very same freezing misery that had claimed his life. She was bleeding for him. She was suffering the cold for his honour. When a sickly, pale green light bloomed in the subterranean darkness, illuminating the lost coin, Cassius felt a violent, tectonic shift in the foundation of his soul. The boy, covered in boils, had summoned it from the muck, but it was the girl who plunged her hand into the freezing water to claim it. The moment her fingers closed around the blackened silver denarius, the crushing, 1900-year weight of Cassius's shame evaporated. Subchapter 5. The New Commander. The frozen food aisle of the Tesco Express faded from his awareness. The endless, confusing purgatory of his existence shattered like thin ice. Cassius materialized in the dark, echoing brick tunnel of the sewer, standing on the narrow ledge before the subterranean stream. He no longer felt the agonizing, phantom frostbite in his fingers. The heavy, suffocating mantle of his disgrace was gone. He looked down at himself and realized, for the first time since 70 AD, that he looked entirely whole. The tether was broken. The anchor had been lifted from the mud. Above him, he felt the subtle, majestic opening of the threshold. The gateway to the afterlife, the Elysian fields, the great library, the eternal rest of the ancestors, was finally unsealed for him. He was free to drift upward, to cross the river and join his fallen brothers in the sunlit fields of glory. The war was over. His watch was ended. But Cassius did not look upward. He looked at the girl. Rhea was kneeling in the muck, her jeans soaked with foul water, a streak of black mud smeared across her forehead. She was shivering violently, her breath pluming in the cold air, but her eyes were bright, and she was clutching his heavy silver coin tightly to her chest, as if it were the most precious object in the empire. She had gone into the dark for him. She had braved the underworld, suffering the freezing mud to restore a dead man's honour. In the ancient laws of the legions, such an act was not merely a favour, it was a profound, unbreakable blood debt. A commander is not defined by the crimson crest on their helmet. A commander is defined by what they are willing to endure for those who stand behind them. This mortal girl, trembling in the cold, possessed more virtues, more raw, undeniable Roman courage than half the patrician generals Cassius had served under. Cassius felt the pull of the afterlife, a gentle, warm gravity urging him to cross over. He planted his heavy boots firmly on the brick ledge and actively, stubbornly rejected it. He was a soldier of Rome. His honour had been restored, yes, but his debt had just been incurred. He could not, and would not, walk into the light while the woman who had saved him was fighting a war of her own. He had heard her desperate pleas in the market. He knew she was facing an eviction, an enemy threatening to destroy her sanctuary. Cassius the centurion stepped forward. The phantom metal of his armour clanked loudly, echoing through the cavernous tunnel. He looked at the heavy silver coin in Rhea's trembling, mud-stained hand. He looked into her dark, resilient eyes. Then, the towering, battle-hardened warlord dropped heavily to one knee. He raised his right arm and pressed his massive, translucent fist flat against his iron breastplate in a crisp, sharp, deeply respectful military salute. It was the salute reserved strictly for an imperator on the battlefield. Through the strange, arrogant ghost floating nearby, Cassius conveyed his oath. He pledged his massive scutum shield, the razor-sharp edge of his gladius, and his eternal, unbroken loyalty to her cause. He anchored his soul anew, not to a patch of freezing mud, but to the silver coin held securely in her pocket. She was the keeper of his honour. She was his commanding officer. The girl squeezed the freezing denarius in her fist. She did not flinch from the weight of his pledge. She stood up, ignoring the mud on her knees, and looked down at him with a sudden, immense courage that chased away the cold of the tunnel. "Tell him the campaign begins at dawn," Rhea said firmly, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Welcome to the resistance, Centurion. Let's get out of this sewer and go save the flat." Cassius rose to his feet, a fierce, warlike joy igniting in his spectral chest. For 1900 years he had been a prisoner of his own failure. Today he was a soldier once more. The threshold to the afterlife closed quietly behind him, but Cassius did not look back. He drew his sword, the phantom steel gleaming in the dark. He had a new commander, a new war, and a new sanctuary to defend. The Centurion marched forward into the dark, ready to hold the line. Tether shifting. In the Ghostwriter universe, tethers are not easily broken or moved. They are formed by immense kinetic energy, willpower, or deep emotional resonance. To purposefully move a tether, 3 elements are required. The warden as the conduit. A ghost cannot simply jump to a new object. Because Rhea possesses the sight and acts as the sanctuary's warden, she must act as the metaphysical bridge. Her living energy absorbs the shock of the transfer. The density of the receptacle. A ghost cannot be tethered to cheap, mass-produced modern items like a plastic phone case or a vape pen, because they lack historical weight. An antique silver pocket watch, however, holds decades of residual human memory and craftsmanship, making it a suitable spectral vessel. The sensory experience. For the ghost, the transfer is highly undignified. It feels like being aggressively shoved through a keyhole while experiencing a massive static electric shock. For Rhea, it feels like holding a live power line. The attic flat was quiet, save for the frantic sound of Rhea aggressively rummaging through her unbleached hemp tote bag. "I cannot take the laptop, Silas," Rhea said, pulling the heavy silver rectangle out and setting it on the walnut desk. "I am going to Aldi in the pouring rain to buy discount toilet paper and cheap pasta. If someone mugs me for my bag, I lose my manuscript, my livelihood, and my resident Victorian critic." Silas materialized near the ceiling, his arms crossed over his tweed waistcoat, looking deeply offended by the logistics. In his previous outing, his spiritual essence had been violently yanked through the doorframe because his tether had accidentally bonded to her creative instrument. "I refuse to remain alone in this drafty box while you engage in commerce," Silas sniffed. "What if the Cistercian monks from downstairs attempt to consecrate the kettle again? I must accompany you. I am your protector. Furthermore, I have opinions on the structural integrity of modern root vegetables that need to be voiced." "Which is exactly why I found this," Rhea said. She reached into her pocket and placed a small, heavy object on top of the laptop. It was a battered, tarnished silver pocket watch. Silas drifted down, his spectral Oxfords hovering an inch above the floorboards. He peered at the object through invisible spectacles. "A 1924 half-hunter? The craftsmanship is acceptable, but the square footage is abysmal. You are asking a man accustomed to a mahogany wingback chair to take up residence in a studio apartment the size of a biscuit." "It's temporary housing," Rhea reasoned. "It fits in my coat pocket. It's practical. My granddad Rishi kept it in a drawer for years. It's got history. It's got gravitas." Silas considered this, his ghostly form glowing a thoughtful, pale sapphire. "And how, pray tell, do you propose we move my spiritual anchor from a machine composed of silicon and plastic into a piece of Georgian silver?" "We are going to use the Warden bypass," Rhea said, trying to sound vastly more confident than she felt. She had been reading Silas's localized occult archives when she was supposed to be writing. "I am the tether. I act as the grounding wire. You let go of the laptop, and I pull your kinetic energy into the watch." "That sounds entirely speculative and highly dangerous," Silas noted. "Do you want to come to Aldi or not?" Silas sighed, a sound like dry autumn leaves scraping against stone. "Very well. But if I end up trapped in the digital ether of your Wi-Fi, I shall haunt your browser history for eternity." Rhea placed her left hand flat on the cold metal of the laptop and her right hand firmly over the silver pocket watch. Okay, on 3. Let go of the manuscript. This is highly undignified, Silas muttered, adjusting his cravat. 1, 2, 3. Rhea squeezed her eyes shut. The moment Silas willed his anchor to detach from the laptop, the air in the attic snapped. A violent, freezing shockwave shot up Rhea's left arm. It felt exactly like grabbing a live electrical wire submerged in ice water. Her teeth ached instantly, and the smell of ancient beeswax and heavy ozone flooded her sinuses. Bloody hell, Rhea gasped, her knees buckling slightly. She visualized the silver watch, actively pulling the surging blue energy across her chest and driving it down her right arm. The pocket watch grew searingly hot against her palm. With a sound like tearing silk, the blue cord of energy snapped away from the laptop and slammed into the silver timepiece. The watch face shattered, the glass cracking in a perfect spiderweb pattern, unable to fully contain the sheer pressure of a century-old ghost. Rhea collapsed into her desk chair, panting, rubbing her chest where the energy had passed through her heart. The room was silent. The laptop was just a laptop again. "Silas!" Rhea wheezed. A localized flurry of spectral frost bloomed across the cracked face of the pocket watch. A moment later, Silas materialized directly beside Rhea's shoulder. His tweed suit was slightly ruffled, and his hair was standing on end with static electricity, making him look like a highly academic mad scientist. He patted himself down, checking for missing limbs. "That," Silas breathed, his voice vibrating with residual shock, "was the metaphysical equivalent of being fired out of a cannon into a keyhole. I demand a moment to regain my composure." Rhea grinned, entirely exhausted but victorious. She scooped the freezing, humming silver watch into the pocket of her wool coat. "Composure regained," Rhea said, heading for the door. "Come on, Casper. Let's go critique the produce aisle. The mechanics of the forced tether. Normally, a ghost is bound to the specific object nearest to them at the moment of their death, or the object that holds their greatest emotional weight. When Silas died in November of 1925, mid-critique of T.S. Eliot, his original anchor was undoubtedly his favourite mahogany wingback chair. However, as the decades bled into one another, that chair was inevitably dragged out of the flat and replaced by a succession of increasingly terrible furniture. A weaker ghost would have been dragged to the municipal dump along with the chair. But Silas was not a weak ghost. He was a man fueled by the furious conviction that a masterpiece must be completed in that room to balance the cosmic scales. To avoid being evicted to a landfill, Silas performed an agonizing feat of supernatural willpower. He forced his tether off the furniture and drove it directly into the physical architecture of Flat 7. He anchored himself to the floorboards, the plaster, and the skirting boards. He became a domestic poltergeist, not by tragedy, but by pure, stubborn spite. He was perfectly content to remain tethered to the flat structure forever, until a 23-year-old girl walked in with a ring light and a laptop. The stubborn architecture of Flat 7. The attic of Flat 7, Cooper's Road, had suffered many indignities since 1925. It had endured the neon spandex workouts of the 1980s, the aggressive grunge rock bass lines of the 1990s, and a truly dark period in 2004 when a university student attempted to learn the bagpipes. Through it all, Silas Thorne remained. He hadn't survived the decades by chance. He had survived through a relentless, exhausting game of metaphysical musical chairs. When his original mahogany wingback chair was unceremoniously hauled out by a landlord in 1952, the tether had threatened to drag Silas's soul out the door with it. To save himself, Silas had thrown his entire spectral weight against the floorboards, violently ripping his kinetic anchor from the mahogany wood and driving it directly into the iron radiator beneath the window. When the radiator was replaced in 1981, he transferred the tether to the original Victorian crown mouldings. He absolutely refused to leave Flat 7. The universe had interrupted his scathing dismantle of the wasteland, a review that would have altered the course of English literature. He was owed a masterpiece. He had planted his translucent feet in the dust of the attic and made a vow. He would not step into the great library in the sky until a work of true, undeniable genius was penned within these exact four walls. So, he anchored himself to the architecture. The flat itself became his prison and his domain. As long as he remained bound to the plaster and the floorboards, he couldn't be dragged away. Then came Ria Khan. She did not look like the saviour of Western literature. She arrived dragging a deflated beanbag and a giant, circular glowing light, wearing an oversized hoodie that read, "Emotionally unavailable." At first, Silas maintained his grip on the room's architecture. He watched her from the damp, peeling corners of the ceiling, fully intending to outlast her, just as he had outlasted the bagpipe player. But Ria possessed something the other tenants hadn't. Underneath her frantic influencer persona and her desperate need to summarize Reddit threads, there was a raw, chaotic, undeniable creative desperation, and she had the sight. She could see and hear him. The shift happened on a miserable Tuesday. Ria had slammed her laptop down on a makeshift desk of wooden crates. She was exhausted, broke, and vibrating with the desperate need to write something that actually mattered. She opened her word processor, the blue light washing over her tired face. Silas drifted down from the ceiling, intending to mock her opening sentence. He floated over her shoulder, preparing to deliver a scathing critique. But as Ria's fingers hit the keyboard, a sudden, violent spark of creative energy erupted in the room. It wasn't a masterpiece, not yet. It was messy, terrified, and profoundly undisciplined. But it was real. It was the strongest surge of genuine authorial intent Flat 7 had seen in 99 years. Silas leaned in too close. The ancient frayed tether connecting his soul to the Victorian crown melding sensed the massive shift in gravity. It recognized the laptop not as a machine, but as a crucible of creation. With a sound like a cracking whip, the invisible blue cord of energy snapped away from the plaster of Flat 7. Silas gasped, a freezing shockwave vibrating through his tweed suit as the tether whipped through the air and slammed directly into the silver chassis of Ria's laptop. Silas stumbled backward in midair, clutching his chest. He looked up at the moulding, then down at the glowing machine resting on the wooden crates. He was no longer bound to the flat. The century-long architectural stalemate was over. He had accidentally chained his eternal soul to a 23-year-old gig worker's hard drive. "Okay, Chapter 1, Ria muttered to herself, completely oblivious to the supernatural contract that had just been forged over her shoulder. The vibes were ominous. Silas stared at the screen, his horror mounting as the terrible sentence materialized. He had waited a century for a masterpiece, and he had just tethered his entire existence to a woman who used the word vibes as a structural plot point. Chapter 1. The Check-In. The attic flat at 42 Cooper's Road no longer smelled like damp plaster, stale takeout, and creative failure. Those were the comfortable, earthly scents of Ria Khan's early 20s, a time when her biggest concern had been making rent and figuring out if you could safely scrape the green mold off a block of cheddar. Now, the flat smelled entirely, unmistakably, of the impossible. It smelled of organic beeswax, decaying parchment, wet sheep's wool, and the distinct, slightly metallic tang of a Roman legionnaire who had been standing in the corner by the radiator for 3 days straight. Outside, the Gloucester sky had opened up, unleashing a torrential, slate-grey downpour that battered against the single-pane sash windows with unrelenting fury. The city's historic docks, usually a picturesque patchwork of narrowboats and red brick warehouses, were currently swallowed by a thick, swirling mist that rolled off the River Severn. The wind howled through the uneven chimney pots of the Victorian terrace, rattling the glass and draft-proofing with equal prejudice. It was the kind of weather that made sane people curl up under thick duvets with a good book. Ria Khan was not currently sane. She sat at her reclaimed walnut desk, a heavy, scarred beast of a thing she had hauled up 3 flights of stairs in a burst of misguided optimism, her chin propped heavily in her hand. She was staring through bloodshot, gritty eyes at the harsh, glaring screen of her laptop. Her dark hair was piled into a messy, haphazard knot at the crown of her head, secured by 2 pencils, and what she was fairly certain was a silver hairpin belonging to a Victorian scullery maid, who occasionally wept in the bathroom. She was trying to write a follow-up pitch to her publisher. It was a desperate, agonizing attempt to prove she wasn't just a one-hit wonder who had lost her mind after the unexpected, explosive success of her debut novel, The Spectral City. That book had been pitched as a work of vivid, imaginative historical fiction. What her publisher, her agent, and the general reading public didn't know was that it hadn't been fiction at all. It had been dictated. But her concentration, already fragile from a diet consisting entirely of instant coffee, stale digestives, and an ever-present low-level hum of existential anxiety, was being systematically dismantled. The source of the distraction was currently in the kitchenette, where a 13th century Cistercian monk was trying to learn how to use a Murphy Richards toaster. Clang, pop, A faint, wet, chanting sound echoed from the cramped cooking space. It was a Gregorian hymn, specifically one usually reserved for funerals, currently being utilized as an incantation of technological exorcism. "Brother Thomas, I have told you." Silas Thorne's voice boomed from the exposed wooden rafters above Rhea's head. The voice didn't just vibrate in the air, it vibrated in Rhea's teeth. It rattled the collection of mason jars filled with protective sea salt and crushed sage on her desk. Silas, who was currently floating 3 feet above the emerald green velvet sofa, was wearing his most formidable 1920s tweed 3-piece suit. The wool looked impeccably tailored, woven from the very fabric of memory, precise down to the spectral pocket square folded into a crisp point over his chest. His ghostly form flickered with a faint, agitated blue light that cast long, unnatural, shifting shadows against the floral wallpaper. When he was calm, Silas looked almost human, save for the slight transparency of his edges. When he was annoyed, which was often, the air around him crackled with atmospheric pressure, like a storm preparing to break. The device is not designed to accept parchment. Silas projected his voice toward the kitchenette, his tone echoing with the refined, patrician exasperation of an Oxford don forced to teach kindergarten. It is not an illuminated manuscript. It operates on the principles of electrical resistance, and if you shove another piece of vellum in there, it will ignite. I will not have my sanctuary burned to the ground because a man who died of the sweating sickness desires a warm snack. Rhea didn't look up from her glaring screen. She just reached out, her fingers blindly tracing the familiar chipped rim of her oversized ceramic mug, and took a long, fortifying sip of lukewarm Earl Grey. It tasted faintly of ozone, a side effect of Silas's proximity. "Silas, let him try," Rhea said, her voice raspy and thin from a chronic lack of sleep. "If he manages to set the toaster on fire, it'll be the most exciting thing to happen in this flat since we terrorized the city council over the zoning permits last year." "It is a culinary atrocity," Silas muttered, his aristocratic features twisting in disgust. He drifted downward, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace that completely ignored gravity. His polished Oxfords stopped exactly 1 inch above the scuffed floorboards, and he hovered just behind Rhea's left shoulder. The ambient temperature around the desk immediately dropped by 10 degrees. A thin, delicate layer of frost bloomed on the rim of Rhea's mug, creeping down the ceramic sides like silver ivy. Silas leaned in, peering over her shoulder at the blinking cursor and the pathetic 3-sentence email draft. "And your subject line is woefully inadequate. Pitch proposal? Really, Rhea? It lacks gravitas. It lacks the fire of a writer who has survived a corporate demolition attempt. It reads like a request for more paper clips from a junior clerk. I am currently running an unregistered, deeply illegal supernatural sanctuary for displaced phantoms in a building that has failed its last 3 municipal safety inspections, Silas." Rhea sighed, finally turning her head to look at him. His blue light illuminated the dark circles under her eyes, casting her face in a harsh, cinematic glow. "Gravitas is a luxury I cannot afford right now. I just need an advance so we can pay the heating bill. Ectoplasm doesn't pay the rent." She let her fingers hover over the keyboard, feeling the familiar, low-level thrum of the tether against her collarbone. It was a physical anchor, a glowing, invisible cord of energy that bound her soul to Silas's essence. It was the reason she hadn't slept a full 8 hours in a year, and the reason Silas hadn't faded into the great echoing void of the afterlife. When he drew on her energy, it felt like a sharp intake of breath on a freezing winter morning. When she leaned on his supernatural awareness, it felt like a jolt of espresso straight to the prefrontal cortex. It kept him anchored to the mortal plane, keeping him from dissipating into the ether, but the toll it took on Ria's physical body was immense. She rubbed her chest right where the invisible tether rooted itself. Besides, if I send them an email titled A Manifesto on the Unquiet Dead, as dictated by a poltergeist in a tweed suit, my agent will have me committed. Silas adjusted his spectral cuffs, looking entirely unrepentant. Genius is rarely recognized in its own time, or, in my case, a century after my time. Have you considered simply threatening them with a localized haunting? I could manifest in their boardroom. A few flickering lights, perhaps a sudden drop in temperature, a bleeding wall. It proved highly effective during the 1928 printers' strike. We are not haunting Penguin Random House, Silas, Ria said firmly, pressing the backspace key to delete pitch proposal. She typed The Drowning Tides, a historical exploration. It was a lie, of course. It wasn't an exploration. It was a memoir of a drowned sailor currently residing in Flat 3B, but the publishing world wasn't ready for non-fiction ghostwriting. Down below them, in Flat 3B, the activity was a constant, low-level roar that vibrated through the floorboards. Flat 3B was the infinitely expanding, labyrinthine threshold gate that her eccentric landlady, Mrs. Pigeon, had so graciously inherited from a long line of incredibly secretive, highly stressed occultists. To the outside world, 3B looked like a standard two-bedroom flat with a rather drafty hallway. To those with the sight, and to the desperate spirits drawn to it like moths to a gaslight, it was a sanctuary. The threshold gate meant that the interior of 3B didn't obey the strict, boring laws of physics or Euclidean geometry. It folded time and space upon itself like a chaotic, architectural accordion, allowing rooms from entirely different centuries to coexist side by side in a spatial impossibility that would have made a quantum physicist weep. Behind the first door on the left was a Tudor kitchen. It smelled perpetually of roasting meats, wood smoke, and stale ale, presided over by a frantic spectral cook who threw spectral root vegetables at anyone who entered without knocking. Behind the second door was a damp, cavernous Roman bathhouse, complete with cracked mosaic tiles, steaming aqueducts, and lounging patricians who were highly critical of modern hygiene standards. Currently, the auditory chaos rising through the floorboards was reaching a crescendo. Bartholomew, a highly opinionated spectral plague victim from 1665, was complaining loudly about the consistency of his morning ghostly porridge. His voice, thick and wheezy, carried right through the plaster. Meanwhile, a secondary choir of monks, the ones who hadn't discovered the toaster yet, were attempting to consecrate the Roman bathhouse into a makeshift chapel, chanting in booming Latin while the Romans yelled back in furious colloquial slang. It was a logistical, chronological, and architectural nightmare. Ria! A deep, booming voice echoed from the stairwell outside the flat, cutting through the Latin chanting and the toaster's electrical buzzing. The heavy wooden door to the attic flat swung open without a knock, crashing violently against the overloaded coat rack. A shower of Ria's scarves and winter hats cascaded to the floor. Mrs. Pigeon burst through the doorway, clutching her signature leopard print fleece dressing gown tight against the chill of the unheated hallway. She was a woman who looked like she had lived through several wars and had aggressively won all of them. She was carrying a battered faux leather clipboard, a thick Sharpie pen, and a look of pure, unadulterated administrative exhaustion. Her hair was now bright red, dyed a shade not found in nature, was curled tight against her scalp in a style that defied humidity. A cigarette dangled precariously from her lower lip, the ash defying gravity by sheer force of the woman's will. "We've got a problem, love," Mrs. Pigeon announced, marching into the room with the heavy, thudding steps of a battlefield commander. She kicked a stray boot out of her way. Actually, we've got 3 problems, but I'm prioritizing the ones that might cause structural damage to the property. Rhea rubbed her temples, feeling a familiar, pulsing headache beginning to take root behind her eyes. Morning, Mrs. Pigeon. Please tell me the Tudor cook hasn't tried to roast the neighbour's cat again. No, the cat is safe. Nasty piece of work, that tabby, but it's safe, Mrs. Pigeon said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. It's Cassius. The Centurion says his helmet is starting to rust because of the humidity rolling off the bathhouse into the main corridor. He is demanding a tribute of sheep's fat to grease his armour, or he threatens to march his cohort through the drywall. He doesn't have a cohort, Silas pointed out, floating slightly higher to avoid the smell of Mrs. Pigeon's cigarette. He is a singular, displaced entity with delusions of grandeur and a remarkable misunderstanding of modern metallurgy. He's got a spear, Mr. Thorne, and he knows how to poke holes in my original Victorian plasterwork, Mrs. Pigeon shot back, not even looking at the ghost. She was one of the rare non-sensitives who had spent so much time around the gate that she had developed a profound, pragmatic immunity to the supernatural. She treated ghosts the same way a tired landlord treated leaky pipes, as a massive inconvenience that required immediate, albeit annoying, maintenance. And the second problem? Rhea asked, pulling a notepad toward her and jotting down sheep's fat /WD-40 for Cassius. Bartholomew, Mrs. Pigeon sighed, taking a deep, rattling drag of her cigarette. The plague victim is trying to sell his porridge spoon on eBay to buy broad-spectrum antibiotics. Rhea blinked, her pen stopping mid-stroke. I'm sorry, what? He cornered Baz in 3B hallway this morning, demanded the boy take photographs of his antique dining implements and list them on the World Wide Web. Said he needs the currency to purchase penicillin because the leeches aren't working. Rhea buried her face in her hands. Please tell Bartholomew that eBay doesn't sell 17th century medical supplies, nor does he have a PayPal account. Also, tell him he is dead. Penicillin will not cure a phantom bubo. He's going to have to stick to his ghosts and maybe stop reading Baz's medical journals. I've told him, Mrs. Pigeon grunted. Told him he's dead as a doornail and antibiotics won't fix a soul that's been out of its body for 400 years. He just mumbled something about capitalist gatekeeping and floated through the ceiling. I swear that boy Baz is teaching them entirely the wrong vocabulary. She exhaled a plume of thick, grey smoke. The cloud drifted right through the space where Silas was hovering, wreathing his translucent form in a toxic, nicotine-scented fog. Silas swatted at the smoke with an offended, translucent hand, his face twisting in aristocratic outrage. He didn't cough. He hadn't drawn breath into his lungs since a tragic, highly undignified altercation with a runaway tram in 1925. But he glared at the landlady with the intensity of a disapproving headmaster about to assign detention. Madam, Silas snapped, his voice crisp and cold, your habits are polluting my airspace. I find the stench of burning tobacco highly offensive to my sensibilities. Mrs. Pigeon ignored him entirely, flipping to the second page on her clipboard. Also, she added, her brash, loud voice suddenly dropping. The commanding edge vanished, replaced by a low, conspiratorial murmur that made Rhea's stomach clench. The air has been feeling heavy downstairs, by the main entrance. Rhea looked up, all exhaustion suddenly replaced by a sharp spike of adrenaline. Heavy how? Cold, Mrs. Pigeon said, wrapping her leopard print fleece tighter around her robust frame. But not like Bartholomew's cold. Bartholomew feels like a damp cellar. Cassius feels like a draft from an open window. This is like oil on water, a wrong sort of cold. A biting cold, made the hairs on my arms stand up, and it takes a lot to do that nowadays. Rhea froze. Her fingers slipped completely off the keyboard. She felt it too. It was a sensation she'd had a few times over the last week. A sudden, sharp prickling at the base of her neck, like a massive static charge building in the air right before a lightning strike. She had dismissed it as exhaustion, or perhaps the changing weather front rolling in off the Atlantic. But now, focusing on it, the feeling was distinct. It wasn't one of their ghosts. The ghosts in the sanctuary were chaotic, needy, frustrating, and occasionally terrifying when they forgot their manners, but they felt human. Their energy was rooted in human emotions: fear, regret, anger, or confusion. They resonated with the warmth of a life once lived. This new sensation felt sharp, clinical, heavy. It felt like the pressure at the bottom of the ocean, dark and crushing. Most of all, it felt incredibly, insatiably hungry. "You feel it too," Rhea whispered, pushing her desk chair back. The casters squeaked loudly against the floorboards. "I feel it in my bones, love," Mrs. Pigeon said, her bravado entirely faded. She stood rigidly, staring at the closed door to the hallway, her cigarette burning down to the filter forgotten in her hand. "It's not just the winter damp getting into my joints. It's like something is watching the building, probing it, running its hands over the bricks, looking for a loose stone. Something that doesn't belong in Gloucester. Something that doesn't belong anywhere near a sanctuary." Above them, Silas Thorne straightened. The spectral academic annoyance vanished from his face in an instant, replaced by a cold, tactical focus that reminded Rhea he hadn't just been a scholar in life. He had been a man who dabbled in the darkest corners of the occult. The faint blue light radiating from him suddenly dimmed, drawing inward until he looked almost entirely solid. The temperature in the room plummeted further, not from his anger, but from his gathering of power. He floated silently toward the hallway door, his eyes narrowed, his posture rigid. "I feel it as well," Silas said. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous register that vibrated against the window panes, a sound like grinding stone. "It is an intrusion. I sensed a perimeter breach 2 nights ago, but it was fleeting, a shadow passing over the sun. This is sustained. It is not a haunting, Rhea." He turned his head slowly to look at her, his spectral eyes glowing with an intense, frightening luminescence. "It is a harvesting. Something knows what we are hiding here. Something smells the concentration of souls." Rhea slammed her laptop shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Instantly, the tether hummed violently against her collarbone. It wasn't the usual dull throb. It was a sharp, painful, buzzing reminder of the bond between them, burning like a branding iron against her skin, warning her of impending, overwhelming danger. She gasped, clapping a hand over her chest. She looked around her beautiful, perfectly curated flat. She looked at the emerald velvet sofa she had painstakingly hauled from a flea market in Cheltenham, the walnut desk she had spent 3 weekends sanding down and treating, the framed, antique botanical prints she had hung on the wall to cover the water stains. She had worked so hard to make this a home. It wasn't just for herself. It was a beacon for the lost things, the forgotten things, the spirits that had nowhere else to go and no one else to remember them. She had given up a normal life, a normal career, and a normal sleep schedule to maintain this sanctuary. She wasn't going to let anyone or anything take it away. "Baz!" Rhea shouted, pitching her voice toward the closed door of the spare bedroom down the short hall. "Baz, get out here." A moment later, the door banged open. Baz tumbled out, stumbling over a pile of extension cords. He was still wearing a silk sleep mask pushed up over his forehead like a bizarre crown, his unruly, dark curls standing on end in every direction. He was wearing an oversized band t-shirt and flannel pajama pants, but despite his disheveled appearance, his hands were steady. He was already holding his expensive camera gimbal in his right hand, the DSLR mounted and recording, and a portable, battery-powered ring light in his left. Baz was Rhea's best friend, her unpaid tech support, her reluctant archivist, and the only person crazy enough to move into a haunted building to film a documentary that no production company would ever believe was real. "Yeah? What's the move?" Baz asked, blinking away sleep as his eyes darted around the room, immediately clocking the tension. He swung the camera toward Silas, checking the exposure on the ghost's glowing form. "We going live? Have the monks finally set off the smoke alarms with their incense? I told you we needed to confiscate their thuribles." "We're going scouting," Rhea said, stepping away from the desk. She grabbed her heavy wool coat from the floor where it had fallen, shrugging it on over her sweater. She reached into the pockets, her fingers brushing against the familiar, comforting shapes of iron nails and small pouches of salt. The hotel is under threat. Mrs. Pigeon felt a breach at the main door. Baz's face fell. The sleepy amusement vanished, replaced by a tight, professional grimace. He tapped a button on the side of his rig, activating an EMF meter attached to the cold shoe mount. It immediately began to click, a steady, rhythmic sound that filled the silence of the room. A breach? Like, the council inspectors are back? Or a breach? A breach, Mrs. Pigeon confirmed grimly. She finally dropped her cigarette stub onto the floor and ground it out beneath the heel of her fuzzy slipper. The nasty kind. Right, okay, I've got full batteries and a pocket full of silver shavings, Baz said, his thumb resting on the record button. Let's go see who's knocking. As they moved toward the door, forming a tight, defensive trio, Silas suddenly held up a translucent hand. Wait, the ghost commanded. The temperature in the room plummeted in a single, terrifying instant. It was so abrupt, so violently cold, that the rain lashing against the window pane froze on contact. With a sound like cracking bones, a thick, jagged spiderweb of ice bloomed across the glass, racing from the corners to the centre, entirely blocking out the grey Gloucester daylight. The room was plunged into a dim, murky twilight, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of Silas and the harsh white LED of Baz's ring light. Rhea gasped as the air hit her lungs. It felt like inhaling powdered glass. Her breath plumed in the air in front of her in thick, white clouds. Beside her, Baz was shivering uncontrollably, his knuckles white around the gimbal handle. "Do you hear that?" Silas whispered. His eyes were fixed with terrifying intensity on the heavy wooden door leading to the hallway. At first, there was nothing. There was only the muffled sound of the storm outside, the rapid, clicking pulse of Baz's EMF meter, and the harsh, panicked sound of their own breathing. Then it began. A low, rhythmic scratching sound echoed from the outside of the heavy wooden door. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't the polite, hesitant tapping of a lost spirit seeking entry to the sanctuary. It was the sound of long, incredibly sharp, impossibly dense nails dragging slowly, deliberately against the solid oak. Scritch. It was a slow, agonizing sound. It moved from the top of the doorframe, dragging down toward the handle. It was the sound of a predator testing a cage, searching for a gap, searching for a weakness in the wood, or a flaw in the wards Rhea had painted along the doorframe in invisible, salt-infused water. Scritch. Rhea stood absolutely motionless, her breath caught in her throat. Her hand was hovering a mere few inches over the brass doorknob. The brass was frosting over, a thin rime of ice crystallizing on the metal, radiating a freezing aura that stung her skin even without touching it. The tether at her chest felt like a live wire, vibrating so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Silas drifted forward, placing himself directly between Rhea and the door, his spectral form solidifying into a brilliant, blinding blue shield of ectoplasmic energy. "That," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet, lacking any of its usual aristocratic arrogance, replaced by the grim certainty of a soldier facing an overwhelming enemy, "is the sound of someone with the sight who does not come to check the plumbing. That is a hunter." The scratching stopped. For a terrifying second, there was absolute silence. Even the EMF meter on Baz's camera went dead quiet. Then, the brass doorknob began to slowly, agonizingly turn. Rhea didn't look at Baz, who had gone entirely, sickly pale behind his camera lens. She didn't look at Mrs. Pigeon, who had raised her battered plastic clipboard in front of her chest, like a desperately inadequate makeshift shield. She looked at the turning doorknob, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird battering against a window. She reached into her pocket, her fingers wrapping tightly around a cold iron nail. The ghost hotel was open for business, but it seemed they were about to get their first violently hostile customer, and Rhea Khan was not about to let them check in without a fight. Chapter 2. The Commute of the Damned. The escape from 42 Cooper's Road had been a frantic, undignified scramble that felt entirely at odds with the supernatural gravity of the situation. After the slow, agonizing scrape of claws against the solid oak of the attic door had ceased, leaving behind a silence so absolute it made Ria's ears ring, there had been a collective, unspoken agreement that standing around waiting for the handle to finish turning was a catastrophically bad idea. Mrs. Pigeon had bolted the door with 3 separate deadbolts, slapped a handful of coarse sea salt against the threshold, and marched downstairs to fortify the lower levels. Ria, driven by a primal surge of adrenaline, had stuffed a change of clothes, her laptop, and Silas's anchor, a battered, tarnished silver pocket watch from 1924, into her oversized hemp tote bag. They had slipped out through the rusted fire escape at the back of the building, the metal freezing and slick beneath their hands, dropping into the alleyway just as the Gloucester sky fully committed to a torrential downpour. Now, an hour later, the adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. The journey to Ria's mother's house was a logistical operation that, in Silas's professional and highly vocal opinion, bordered on a crime against human dignity. They were squeezed into a second-class carriage on a Great Western Railway train that smelled overwhelmingly of soggy umbrellas, stale vinegar crisps, and deep, institutional disappointment. The carriage was overly bright, illuminated by harsh fluorescent strips that hummed with a low, headache-inducing frequency. The windows were fogged with the collective condensation of 50 damp passengers, transforming the outside world into a smeared, watery, impressionist painting of the English countryside. Baz had insisted on taking the train rather than renting a car or braving the unpredictable local bus routes. He claimed it allowed for optimal lighting transitions and steady framing for his vlog, a statement that had caused Silas to spend the first 20 minutes of the trip loudly and creatively critiquing the lack of a proper dining car. A proper rail journey requires a white tablecloth, a heavy silver service, and an attendant who understands the precise steeping time of Darjeeling, Ria, Silas complained. His spectral form was flickering with agitation, glowing a sharp, electric blue as the train lurched violently over a set of points outside Stroud. Because of the physical restrictions of the tether, the glowing, invisible cord of energy that connected Ria's collarbone to the silver pocket watch in her tote bag, and subsequently to Silas himself, the ghost couldn't wander far. He was forced to hover just above the narrow aisle seat next to Ria. His immaculate 1920s tweed 3-piece suit, complete with a spectral pocket square and polished Oxfords, looked aggressively out of place next to the teenager sitting across the aisle, who was currently playing a tinny, hyperactive hip-hop beat through the speaker of a cracked smartphone. Instead, Silas continued, his voice echoing with the clipped patrician vowels of a bygone era, we are huddled amongst the masses, like cattle being led to the abattoir. We are surrounded by the scent of lukewarm vending machine coffee, damp polyester, and the unceasing cacophony of digital noise. Look at them, Ria. They do not converse. They stare into their little glowing rectangles, their souls slowly draining into the ether. It is a tragedy of modern existence. Ria stared out the rain-streaked window at the blurring green fields of the Cotswolds, ignoring him. She rested her forehead against the cold glass, letting the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the train tracks soothe the pounding behind her eyes. It's a train, Silas, she murmured under her breath, keeping her lips barely moving so the other passengers wouldn't think she was talking to herself. Not a luxury cruise liner, not the Orient Express. It's public transport. Just be happy we aren't driving. I absolutely cannot handle the suspension on Mrs. Pigeon's Nissan Micra today. Not after whatever that was at the door. I would prefer the mechanical peril of the Nissan to this indignity, Silas retorted, crossing his arms over his ghostly chest. He glared at the teenager across the aisle, briefly lowering the ambient temperature around the boy's phone until a layer of frost bloomed across the screen, causing the music to sputter and die. The teenager cursed, shaking his device in confusion. Silas looked immensely satisfied. Baz, huddled in the seat directly opposite Ria, was completely oblivious to the localized freezing. He was currently balancing a heavy camera gimbal on his knee, wiping a smudge off the lens with the hem of an oversized, faded band t-shirt. His dark, unruly curls were plastered to his forehead from the rain, and he looked incredibly out of place on a Tuesday afternoon commuter train. "Chat, we are currently en route to Ria's mum's place," Baz said, pitching his voice into that slightly elevated, overly enthusiastic tone he used whenever he was recording. He held the camera up, framing himself and Ria in the shot, carefully avoiding the empty space where Silas was hovering, mostly because the ghost's ectoplasmic output tended to cause rolling static bars on digital footage. "We're doing a family origin story arc today, leaving the sanctuary behind for a bit of a strategic retreat. Things got a little spicy at the hotel this morning. Uninvited guests, negative energy. We're seeking elder wisdom." Baz turned the camera slightly toward Ria, who offered a weak, deeply unimpressed peace sign without lifting her head from the window. "Also," Baz added, lowering the camera slightly and shivering, "does anyone else feel like the air conditioning on this train is completely failing? It's absolutely freezing in here. I know it's November, but it feels like a meat locker." He rubbed his hands vigorously up and down his arms, his teeth actually chattering as the air around him dropped another 5 degrees. "That's just the proximity of the history we're carrying," Ria muttered, sitting up and leaning over to zip up her hemp tote bag a little tighter. Inside the bag, buried beneath her laptop and a spare sweater, the tether pulsed. To anyone else, it was just a bag, but to Ria, it felt like she was carrying a localized thunderstorm. The connection was faint but steady, a rhythmic thrumming against her sternum that matched her heartbeat. The closer she was to Silas, the colder the physical environment became as he drew ambient heat to maintain his manifestation. "And," Ria added, looking directly at Baz, "the ghost you can't see is currently mocking your fashion sense. So, there's that." Silas didn't need to be seen to be heard by Ria, though to Baz the ghost was merely a sensation, a sudden drop in pressure, a prickle of static electricity, the smell of ozone and old paper. "I am not merely mocking his fashion sense," Silas boomed, his voice echoing in the confined space of the carriage. He drifted slightly closer to Baz, his translucent face twisting into an expression of profound academic horror. "I am lamenting the utter collapse of civilization as evidenced by the existence of denim trousers with intentional factory-made holes in the knees. It is not fashion, Ria. It is a sign of societal decay. In my day, if a man wore ripped trousers, he was either a destitute vagabond, or he had recently survived an explosion. This boy paid good currency to look like he fell out of a moving carriage." "He says he hates your ripped jeans," Ria translated dutifully, sighing. "They're vintage distressed, Ria. Tell him it's a stylistic choice," Baz defended himself, looking mildly offended as he adjusted the knee of his jeans. "It's called grunge. Not that a guy who died before the invention of the electric guitar would understand." "I understand perfectly well that the structural integrity of the garment has been compromised for vanity," Silas shot back, though he knew Baz couldn't hear him. The ghost turned his attention back to the window, his form shimmering as the train plunged into a long, dark tunnel. In the sudden darkness, Silas's blue glow became the brightest thing in the carriage, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the ceiling. Ria watched him in the reflection of the glass. Even after a year of being bound to him, of sharing her living space and her life force with a man who had been dead for nearly a century, there were moments when the reality of it still caught her off guard. Silas Thorne had been an occult scholar, an author, and a minor annoyance to the academic establishment of the 1920s before his untimely death. He was brilliant, arrogant, fiercely protective, and endlessly exhausting. Their partnership had begun as a desperate accident, but it had evolved into something permanent. He was the co-author of her life, the invisible shield that guarded her sanctuary, and currently the biggest snob on the Great Western Railway. As the train burst out of the tunnel and back into the grey, rain-soaked daylight, Ria let her mind drift to their destination. They were heading to a small, painfully picturesque village in the deep Cotswolds where the stone was the colour of honey and the cell reception was virtually non-existent. It was where Rhea had grown up, and more importantly, it was where Amira Khan lived. Rhea's mother was a woman who had spent her entire life running from the exact things Rhea had built a career embracing. Amira had the sight, the same genetic, spiritual anomaly that allowed Rhea to see and communicate with the dead. But where Rhea saw lost souls needing a sanctuary, Amira saw parasites. She saw danger. When Rhea had first manifested her abilities as a teenager, her mother had locked down the house with iron and salt, refusing to acknowledge the shadows that lingered in the corners of the rooms. Amira had demanded a normal life, shutting off her abilities through sheer, stubborn willpower and a strict adherence to absolute mundanity. She joined the local parish council, baked competitively for the village fete, and pretended that the invisible world didn't exist. When Rhea had published The Spectral City, when she had leaned into the magic, turning Silas's dictated memories into a best-selling novel, her mother had barely spoken to her for months. Going to Amira for help was a last resort, but the thing at the door of the attic flat hadn't been a lost spirit looking for a safe haven. It had been something else. Something dark, intentional, and terrifyingly strong. If there was anyone who knew how to ward against a hunter, it was the woman who had spent 30 years perfectly hiding her own magical signature from the world. The journey passed in a blur of clattering tracks, endless green fields intersected by dry stone walls, and Silas's ongoing, increasingly elaborate critiques of the pre-recorded station announcements. "The cadence is entirely wrong," Silas muttered as a disembodied, digitized female voice announced their approach to Kemble Station. "It lacks authority. It lacks the reassuring human warmth required to guide travellers. It sounds like a machine apologizing for a delay it orchestrated." "It is a machine, Silas," Rhea said, rubbing her eyes. "Please stop haunting the public address system. We're almost there." However, as the train began to decelerate, leaning into a long curve that followed the line of a swollen, rushing river, the atmosphere inside the carriage abruptly shifted. It wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping change, like a tide rolling in. The air grew heavy. It felt thick, almost viscous, pressing against Rhea's eardrums with a subtle, uncomfortable pressure. Rhea noticed it first. The exhaustion that had been dulling her senses suddenly evaporated, replaced by the sharp, primal sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, prickling against the collar of her wool coat. She had spent enough time surrounded by the dead to know what a haunted space felt like. The attic flat at Cooper's Road always felt full, humming with the chaotic, emotional residue of its spectral residents. Ghosts left an imprint of humanity, a cold draught fueled by sorrow, a smell of old perfume born of nostalgia, a sudden flicker of lights caused by residual anger. But this feeling was entirely different. This was cold, calculated, and terrifyingly sharp. It didn't feel like a presence. It felt like an absence. "Silas," Rhea whispered, her voice tightening. She sat up straight, her hand dropping off the armrest to grip the handle of the laptop bag sitting by her feet. Her knuckles went white. "Silas, do you feel that?" Silas fell entirely silent. Mid-sentence, his rant about the structural failures of modern diesel engines died on his ethereal lips. His spectral form, usually in a state of constant, fluid motion, went terrifyingly still. The soft, ambient blue light that radiated from him began to change, sharpening and condensing until it burned with the harsh, intense glare of a bright sapphire. He no longer looked like an academic in a tweed suit. He looked like an apex predator catching a scent on the wind. He didn't answer Rhea immediately. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, his glowing eyes scanning the length of the crowded carriage. He looked past the teenager with the phone, past the sleeping businessman 2 rows down, past the elderly couple sharing a thermos of tea. He was looking through the physical world, peering into the unseen layers of reality. "I feel it," Silas said. His voice had lost all its theatrical snobbery. It had dropped to a low, gravelly whisper that vibrated not in the air, but directly against the tether anchored to Rhea's chest. It was a sound that sent a jolt of pure ice water through her veins. "I feel an erasure," Silas continued, his eyes narrowing as he stared toward the sliding glass doors at the end of the carriage. "It is not a ghost, Rhea. It is not an echo of a life. It is a void. It is a vacuum." "A void? What does that mean?" Rhea asked, her heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She glanced at Baz, who was still looking at his phone, entirely oblivious to the sudden, lethal tension radiating from the ghost. "When a spirit manifests, it adds energy to the environment," Silas explained, drifting slightly closer to Rhea, his form becoming denser, almost opaque as he pulled energy through the tether to prepare for a physical manifestation. "It creates a footprint. This entity is pulling energy out. It is consuming the ambient magic in the air. Someone is utilizing the site, but they are not guarding the dead, Rhea. They are hunting them." Rhea swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry as dust. "Hunting them? You mean like an exorcist?" "Exorcists banish," Silas corrected, his voice grim. "They return souls to the cycle. This presence does not intend to banish. It intends to consume. It is the same signature we felt at the door of the sanctuary, but magnified." "What do we do?" "We do not engage," Silas said firmly. "I mean," he added, his sapphire gaze locking onto Rhea's frightened face, "that someone is out there, Rhea. Someone who knows exactly what we are. They are not looking for random ghosts. They are looking for power, and they are looking for tethers." Rhea felt a sudden, sickening jolt in her stomach, a sensation akin to missing a step on a staircase in the dark. The train's brakes shrieked, a high, metallic squeal that set her teeth on edge as the carriages began to slow down for their final approach into the station. Outside the window, the picturesque rolling hills had given way to the damp, grey concrete of the platform. The station was small, just a ticket office, a waiting shelter, and a few cast-iron lampposts. The rain was coming down in sheets, pooling in dark, reflective puddles on the tarmac. Rhea looked out the window as the train hissed, the hydraulic suspension groaning as it finally came to a complete halt. On the platform, standing under the dim, flickering light of a solitary, malfunctioning lamppost, was a man. He was standing perfectly, unnervingly still. While the few other passengers on the platform were huddled under umbrellas or sprinting toward the shelter to escape the deluge, this man seemed entirely unbothered by the weather. He wore a long, dark trench coat that hung heavily around his frame. The fabric looked odd, too dense, absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. The rain seemed to hit his shoulders and simply vanish, absorbed into the dark material without leaving a trace of moisture. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't checking a watch, looking for a ticket, or waiting for a loved one. He was just standing there, an immovable anchor in the storm, his head tilted slightly upward, and his eyes were fixed directly on their carriage. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked too solid, too painfully present in the physical world. But he looked far, far worse than any spirit Rhea had ever encountered. Ghosts were trapped by their pasts, bound by their own tragedies. This man looked like a manifestation of future violence. Even through the rain-streaked, fogged-up glass of the train window, Rhea could feel the weight of his gaze. He wasn't looking at the train itself. He was looking through the metal, through the glass, straight into the centre of the carriage. He was looking straight at the canvas tote bag by Rhea's feet. He was looking directly at the tether. "Baz," Rhea said, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. She reached across the aisle and grabbed her friend's wrist, her fingers digging into his skin. Baz jumped, startled, looking up from his camera screen. "Ow! Hey, what's wrong? You look like you're going to throw up. Is it motion sickness? I told you not to sit backward facing." "Don't look out the window," Rhea commanded, her eyes wide, her breathing turning shallow and fast. "Just pack up the rig. Right now." "By who? The council?" Baz asked, his journalistic instincts overriding his confusion. Instead of putting the camera down, he immediately hit the record button on the side of his phone, pivoting the lens toward the window. "Are we being followed by zoning enforcement? Did Mrs. Pigeon finally get served those papers?" No, Rhea breathed. She couldn't look away from the window. The train doors unlocked with a loud electronic beep, followed by the heavy pneumatic hiss of the doors sliding open. A gust of freezing, rain-scented air swept into the carriage, blowing away the smell of stale coffee and instantly replacing it with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and static. The man in the dark coat slowly turned his head. From beneath the brim of a sodden hat, Rhea caught a glimpse of his face. It was pale, gaunt, and entirely devoid of expression, like a mask carved from old bone. His eyes were dark, fathomless pits that seemed to pull the light from the air around him. He took a step forward, moving toward the open doors of their specific carriage. He didn't walk like a normal person. His movements were too fluid, devoid of the natural bounce of human steps. He glided over the wet concrete, his boots making absolutely no sound. By someone who knows the rules, Rhea finished, her hand dropping to the bag, her fingers desperately curling around the fabric where Silas's pocket watch lay hidden. Silas materialized fully, standing in the aisle between Rhea and the open train doors. He was no longer a glowing projection. He looked as solid as a living man, his tweed suit impeccably sharp, his posture rigid. The air in the carriage plummeted to freezing, a thick layer of frost exploding across the windows in jagged, crystalline patterns, completely obscuring the view of the platform. "Get up, Rhea," Silas commanded, his voice ringing with the authority of a general on the front line. "Do not let him board this vessel. If he crosses the threshold of these doors, we are trapped in a steel box with a harvester." Baz, finally sensing the absolute terror in the air and the impossible cold radiating from the aisle, dropped his camera into his lap. "Rhea, what is happening? Who is that guy?" "We have to move," Rhea said, hauling her heavy bag over her shoulder. The tether hummed a frantic, burning warning against her skin. "We go out the opposite side. The trackside doors. Now." "The trackside? Are you insane? That's a live rail down there," Baz protested, but he was already standing up, spurred by the sheer panic radiating from his friend. "I'd rather take my chances with a few thousand volts of electricity," Rhea said, shoving past him toward the emergency release handle on the doors opposite the platform. "Then find out what that man wants to do with my ghost." Behind them, a heavy, utterly silent footstep landed on the metal grating of the train's boarding step. A shadow fell across the aisle, long and dark, stretching out to touch the toe of Silas's polished Oxford shoe. The hunter had arrived. Chapter 3. The Scuttle in the Attic. The escape from the train had been a desperate, chaotic blur of panicked shouting, sliding doors, and the terrifying, lung-freezing proximity of the sea elector. Rhea had yanked the emergency release handle with a strength born entirely of adrenaline, hauling the heavy doors open just as the shadow of the man in the dark coat fell across the aisle. The drop from the carriage down to the track bed was a blind 4-foot plunge into soaked gravel and rusted metal. Baz had landed hard on his knees, cursing loudly and instinctively shielding his expensive camera rig from the impact with his own body. Rhea had tumbled after him, the heavy hemp tote bag clutched to her chest like an infant, the tether humming so violently against her skin it felt like a swarm of angry wasps trapped beneath her collarbone. They had scrambled down the embankment, sliding through wet nettles and thick, sucking mud, while Silas hovered above them, a brilliant, blazing shield of blue ectoplasmic energy acting as a rear guard. By the time the train had finally hissed and groaned its way out of the station, carrying the silent, terrifying man away with it, Rhea and Baz were soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably and entirely out of breath. The subsequent walk from the rural station to Rhea's childhood home had been a miserable 2-mile trudge through quintessential English drizzle. The Cotswold village, usually a picturesque patchwork of honey-coloured stone cottages, winding lanes and aggressively well-tended flower beds, was currently swallowed by a thick, oppressive grey mist. "I think my socks have merged with my skin," Baz complained, his teeth chattering as they turned the final corner onto Chestnut Avenue. He was limping slightly, his vintage, distressed jeans now genuinely distressed and caked in thick, chalky mud. He had stowed his camera in a waterproof dry bag, but he still clutched it defensively against his chest. I'm pretty sure I have trench foot. Do people still get trench foot? If I die of exposure, Rhea, I swear I'm coming back to haunt your bathroom. You couldn't haunt a bathroom, Baz, Rhea said, her voice thin and exhausted. She pushed a heavy, wet strand of dark hair out of her eyes. You don't have the attention span. You'd get bored and wander off to haunt a coffee shop with good Wi-Fi within a week. I would haunt a server farm, Baz corrected, shivering. At least it's climate-controlled. Above them, gliding effortlessly over the rain-slicked pavement without leaving a single ripple in the puddles, Silas adjusted his tweed waistcoat. The boy lacks the necessary gravitas for a proper haunting. The ghost agreed, his voice echoing in Rhea's mind via the tether, saving him the effort of projecting his voice into the damp air. He would simply make the electronic devices malfunction. A nuisance, not a phantom. Furthermore, if he does expire from this damp, I refuse to share the attic flat with him. His wardrobe in the afterlife would be insufferable. Nobody is dying today, Rhea muttered, though the memory of the man on the platform, the absolute soul-crushing void he had radiated, made her stomach twist into a cold knot. They finally stopped outside number 14. The childhood home was a mid-terrace house on a quiet, unassuming street that seemed permanently stuck in 1998. While the rest of the village boasted grand, centuries-old masonry, Chestnut Avenue was an anomaly of mid-20th century brickwork, pebble-dash exteriors, and sensible, double-glazed UPVC windows. It was the house of Rhea's youth, a place where the walls were thick with floral-patterned wallpaper, the shelves groaned under the weight of dusty, inherited brass ornaments, and the air always carried the lingering, comforting, deeply ingrained scent of her mum's cardamom tea and toasted cumin. But today, the house looked different. The familiar, welcoming warmth was missing. The floral curtains had been taken down from the front window, exposing the bare, stark living room to the street. A massive, white rental van was parked half on the curb in front of the driveway, its rear doors wide open, ready to swallow 30 years of memories. Right, Rhea said, taking a deep breath and trying to wipe some of the mud off her coat. Just follow my lead. Don't mention the train. Don't mention the man in the coat. And whatever you do, do not tell my mother that we are currently harbouring a 1920s occultist in my tote bag. My lips are sealed, Baz said, offering a weak salute. Rhea pushed the front door open. It was already slightly ajar, propped open by a heavy terracotta pot, and stepped into the chaotic hallway. The immediate sensory overload was profound. The comforting smell of cardamom was still there, but it was currently battling with the sharp, chemical scent of packing tape, dusty cardboard, and industrial cleaning supplies. The hallway, usually a pristine passage adorned with family photographs and a relentlessly vacuumed carpet, was an obstacle course of moving boxes, rolled-up rugs, and precarious stacks of Tupperware. Standing in the absolute centre of the chaos, wielding a tape dispenser like a weapon, was Mira Khan. Rhea's mother was a woman of fierce, practical energy. She was petite, but she possessed a commanding presence that could clear a room faster than a fire alarm. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly into a functional braid, and she was wearing her serious business clothes. A pair of comfortable track pants and a faded oversized sweater that she only wore when deep cleaning or moving furniture. Currently, she was wrestling a heavy, incredibly overstuffed cardboard box labelled Kitchen, Spices and Do Not Touch with thick black marker. Standing a few feet away, leaning against the doorframe of the stripped-down living room and holding a steaming mug of tea, was Auntie Sala. Sala wasn't actually a blood relative. She was Mira's oldest friend, a woman whose entire personality consisted of sharp observations, unsolicited advice, and an uncanny ability to never lift a finger during physical labour while somehow taking credit for the results. No, Sala, you cannot pack the heavy cast-iron pans on top of the china, Mira was shouting as Rhea stepped through the door, aggressively ripping a strip of tape. What is wrong with your spatial awareness? Gravity exists. I was merely optimizing the space, Mira, Sala replied smoothly, taking a sip of her tea. You always overcomplicate things. If the china breaks, it is the universe telling you it is time to buy a modern set. Those plates are hideous anyway." "They were my mother's," Mira snapped. Then she turned, the tape dispenser freezing midair as she finally noticed the muddy, dripping arrivals in her hallway. "Rhea! Beta!" Mira shouted, dropping the heavy box. It hit the floorboards with a resounding, dangerous thud that made Sala wince. Mira surged forward, navigating the maze of boxes with practiced agility, and threw her arms around Rhea. She hugged her daughter with the desperate, crushing force of someone who had been holding her breath for weeks, completely ignoring the fact that Rhea was soaking wet and covered in railway mud. "Hi, Mum," Rhea gasped, the breath knocked out of her. A wave of profound guilt washed over her as she looked over her mother's shoulder at the chaotic, half-dismantled hallway. She should have been here days ago. She should have been helping pack, wrapping the fragile things, sorting through the attic. Instead, she had been dealing with ghost politics and almost getting her soul drained on public transport. "I'm sorry I'm late. The train was an absolute nightmare." Mira pulled back, keeping her hands on Rhea's shoulders, her dark eyes scanning her daughter's pale face. "You look exhausted, Rhea. Are you eating? You feel entirely made of elbows. And why are you so wet? Do you not own an umbrella? I bought you that sturdy one from Marks and Spencer for Christmas." "It broke, Mum," Rhea lied smoothly. "Wind." Sala stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as they flicked past Rhea to the shivering, dishevelled young man standing awkwardly in the doorway. She adjusted her glasses, looking Baz up and down with the clinical precision of a customs officer searching for contraband. "And who is this young man?" Sala asked, her tone dripping with mild suspicion. She pointed a manicured finger at Baz. "This is Baz, my business partner," Rhea said quickly. "He helps me with the documentary work, the historical research. Baz, this is my mum, Mira, and my auntie Sala." Baz offered a highly respectful, slightly tremulous nod. "Lovely to meet you both, truly. Beautiful home. Or, what's left of it in the boxes." Sala didn't look impressed. She stared at the holes in Baz's jeans. "You pay this boy a salary, Rhea, and he cannot afford complete trousers." "It's fashion, Auntie," Rhea sighed, stepping fully into the house and dragging her heavy tote bag with her. The bag clanked against the doorframe, a dull, metallic sound from the pocket watch inside. "And an old family friend, Silas," Rhea added, gesturing vaguely to the empty air hovering just above the staircase landing. Silas, who had drifted upward to avoid the claustrophobic crush of boxes and maternal energy, performed a stiff, impeccably polite aristocratic bow to the two women. "A pleasure, madam," Silas boomed, his voice echoing only in Rhea's mind. "Your hallway is delightfully symmetrical, despite the current chaotic state of affairs. The original Victorian moulding has been well preserved beneath the dreadful 1990s paint job. It is a rare find in this era of cheap plaster and chaotic minimalism." "He says the hallway is nice," Rhea translated quickly, before Silas could offer his opinions on Sala's eyewear. She quickly ushered Baz inside, closing the heavy front door behind them to shut out the grey afternoon. "Well, tell your friend Silas he is very polite," Mira said, picking up her tape dispenser again. She didn't look at the empty space above the stairs. She didn't look anywhere near it. "Who's Silas?" Sala asked, looking puzzled. Mira waved her hand dismissively and carried on packing. Rhea's heart ached slightly. Her mother had the sight. Mira could absolutely see Silas. She could see the faint blue glow illuminating the dust motes above the banister. She could likely feel the sudden drop in temperature, but Mira Khan had spent 30 years perfecting the art of absolute, unwavering denial. If a ghost wasn't wearing a physical name tag and carrying a utility bill, Mira refused to acknowledge its existence. "You are finally here," Mira continued, a frantic edge returning to her voice as she looked at the mountain of boxes. "The movers come tomorrow morning at 8 sharp, Rhea. 8. And I have 10 years of junk still to sort through upstairs. The bedrooms are done, but the attic is a disaster. It is full of your granddad's things." "I'll handle the attic, Mum," Rhea said softly, unbuttoning her wet coat. That's why I'm here. You go rest. Have some of Sala's tea." "I am not resting until this house is in a truck," Mira declared, though she looked incredibly relieved. "Take your friend Baz to the kitchen. There are clean towels in the downstairs bathroom. Dry off and then go upstairs. But be careful. The ladder is tricky." Rhea nodded, leading Baz through the narrow corridor toward the back of the house. The house felt fundamentally empty, completely hollowed out by the packing process. The carpets had the distinct, indented squares where heavy furniture had sat for decades. The walls were dotted with slightly darker, rectangular patches of wallpaper where pictures had shielded the floral patterns from the sun. It was the skeleton of a home, stripped of its meat. But as Rhea stepped out of the hallway and began to climb the stairs to the first floor, leaving Baz in the kitchen to aggressively towel dry his hair, she felt a familiar, lingering chill. It wasn't the dangerous, biting, predatory cold they had encountered at the train station. That cold had felt like standing in a walk-in freezer with a predator. This cold was different. It was a sad, damp, nostalgic cold. It felt like a draft coming from a room that hadn't been opened in years. It was Arthur. The grumpy, deeply territorial, coal-scuttle-tethered ghost of Grandad Khan's house was still here. Rhea climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the wooden banister. Silas floated silently beside her, his glowing form casting long, blue shadows against the blank walls. "He is agitated," Silas noted, his spectral eyes looking upward toward the ceiling hatch on the landing. "The kinetic energy of the packing has disturbed his rest. He is drawing heavily on his anchor to maintain his presence." "He's confused," Rhea murmured, stepping onto the landing. "He doesn't understand what's happening." She stood beneath the square wooden hatch set into the ceiling. The air here was noticeably colder, her breath faintly pluming in the dim light. She reached up with the long, hooked wooden pole her mother kept leaned against the wall, hooked the brass ring of the hatch, and pulled. The wooden door swung downward with a creak of old hinges, revealing the folded aluminium sections of the loft ladder. A cascade of fine, grey dust drifted down, catching in the light. "Arthur?" Rhea called out softly into the absolute darkness of the upstairs landing. For a moment, there was nothing but the muffled sound of Mira and Sala bickering downstairs in the hallway. Then, a faint, metallic rattling sound, the distinct clatter of brass against wood, drifted down from the gaping black square of the attic. "Grandad's gone, girl," a raspy, mournful voice replied from the shadows above. It was a voice thick with the accent of the industrial Midlands, a voice that sounded like it had been scraped across a cobblestone street. It belonged to a man who hadn't spoken to a living soul, besides Rhea, since the turn of the millennium. "They're moving everything." Arthur's voice trembled, a pathetic, ghostly echo. "The chairs are gone. The telly's gone. Even the good rug with the tassels. But I'm not going anywhere. I've got my scuttle." Rhea sighed, a puff of white mist escaping her lips. She gripped the cold aluminium rungs of the ladder and began to climb. The attic was a vast, triangular space of deep shadows and fat, undisturbed spiders. The air was thick and stale, smelling heavily of dry rot, old fiberglass insulation, and the distinct, dusty scent of forgotten Christmas decorations. The only illumination came from a single, bare, low-wattage bulb hanging from a wire in the center of the roof apex, casting harsh, swinging shadows across the wooden joists. The floorboards were uneven, stacked high with the detritus of a family's history. Suitcases from the 80s, rolled-up posters, sealed boxes of old school reports, and a dismantled baby crib. In the very center of the chaos, sitting squarely on top of a battered leather trunk, was a heavy brass coal scuttle. It was an antique piece, wide at the base and curving up to a sturdy handle. It was tarnished, dented on one side, and coated in a thick layer of dust. But to Rhea's eyes, it wasn't just old metal. It was glowing. It radiated a faint, pathetic, flickering orange aura, like the dying embers of a fire that was desperately trying not to go out. Arthur sat on the trunk right beside it. He was a ghost firmly stuck in his era. He appeared as a pale, middle-aged man, wearing a flat wool cap pulled low over his eyes, a heavy tweed waistcoat, and a collarless shirt with rolled-up sleeves. His skin was the colour of old, damp parchment, and his form was highly translucent, flickering unsteadily with the orange light of his tether. He had his knees pulled up to his chest, his ghostly arms wrapped defensively around the brass scuttle. He looked profoundly, overwhelmingly lost. "Hello, Arthur," Rhea said softly, stepping off the ladder and carefully balancing on the structural joists so she wouldn't put her foot through the bedroom ceiling below. Silas drifted up through the floorboards a second later, ignoring the ladder entirely. He stepped into the attic with a fluid grace that completely ignored the uneven footing. The glowing blue light of Silas's presence clashed harshly with the weak orange aura of Arthur's scuttle, casting strange purple shadows across the cardboard boxes. Silas adjusted his cuffs and floated closer, examining the coal scuttle with genuine, academic interest. "Fascinating," Silas murmured, leaning over the brass object. A brass coal receptacle. Truly a unique and highly specific anchor. Most entities of your class tether to items of immense emotional sentiment. A locket, a wedding ring, a weapon of consequence. But this possesses a profound working-class character, the residual energy of manual labour. Arthur looked up, his pale, sunken eyes narrowing at Silas. He tightened his ghostly grip on the metal handle. "Who's the toff?" he snapped, his raspy voice defensive. "This is Silas, Arthur," Rhea said, carefully lowering herself to sit on a sturdy-looking box of old encyclopedias across from the ghost. "He's a friend. He lives with me in Gloucester." But he looks like he's never done a hard day's work in his life," Arthur grumbled, though he shrank back slightly from the intense cold Silas radiated. "He's too bright. Hurts my eyes." "I assure you, my scholarly pursuits were incredibly taxing," Silas sniffed, looking mildly offended. "Mental exertion is a valid form of labour. Not all of us were meant to shovel carbon composites." "Arthur," Rhea interrupted, keeping her voice incredibly gentle. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "We need to talk about the house. You know what's happening downstairs, don't you?" Arthur's pale face fell. He looked away from Rhea, staring into the dark, dusty corner of the eaves. "They're leaving. Your mum. She's packing it all up. I heard her telling that Sala woman. They're selling the brick and mortar." "Yes," Rhea said softly. "Mum is moving to live with Auntie Sala closer to the city. The house has been sold to a young couple. They're going to completely gut the place, Arthur. They want an open-plan living room. They're going to empty this attic entirely." Arthur hugged the scuttle tighter, his translucent knuckles turning a stark, glowing white. "They can't take this. It's mine. Grandad Khan gave it to me." Rhea knew the story. Arthur had been a friend of her grandfather's, a fellow worker at the local railway yard decades ago. When Arthur had died, a sudden, tragic heart attack alone in his own damp flat, he had latched onto the only object in the world that someone had consistently cared for, in his honour. Grandad Khan had taken the scuttle, kept it by his own fireplace, and polished it every single Sunday. It was an act of remembrance that had accidentally forged a tether, trapping Arthur in the house long after Grandad Khan had passed away. "Arthur," Rhea said, choosing her words with absolute precision, "if you stay here, if this scuttle goes into a box tomorrow morning, you go with it. If the movers take it to a charity shop, you will be trapped in the back room of an Oxfam for decades. If they take it to the municipal tip, you'll be dragged with it into the crusher." Arthur flinched violently at the word crusher. "You could end up buried under a landfill, Arthur," Rhea continued, her voice taking on a desperate urgency. "Or worse. This house is being renovated. A modern family is moving in. They'll put in gas central heating, underfloor heating. There will be no coal, no fires, no soot. You'll be trapped in a home with no use for your anchor, slowly fading into nothing, because there's no energy to sustain you." Arthur's pale face went a shade paler, his ghostly form flickering dangerously until he was almost invisible. I didn't think about that. The charity shop. The landfill." He looked down at the brass metal, his expression breaking into genuine terror. "Come with us," Rhea said, holding out a hand, though she knew he couldn't physically touch her. "We have a sanctuary, A place called 3B down in Gloucester. It's, well, it's unconventional, but it's safe. A sanctuary? Arthur mumbled, looking up at her cautiously. It's a hotel for ghosts, Rhea explained, offering a reassuring smile. It's a threshold gate. It's got hallways that stretch on forever, rooms from different centuries, spaces for everyone. You won't be trapped in a dusty attic anymore. You can have a fireplace, a real one. We'll find you a massive hearth, Arthur. We'll set up this coal scuttle right next to it, a brass one, polished every Sunday, the works. You'll be safe, and you won't be alone. Arthur looked at the scuttle, then at Silas, whose bright blue aura felt oddly protective in the dim space, and then back to Rhea. He hesitated, his spectral fingers tracing the dent in the brass. Is it crowded? Arthur asked, his voice trembling. I don't much like crowds, or loud noises, or modern music. It's a hotel, Rhea said, thinking of the screaming Roman legionnaires, the chanting monks, and the plague victim trying to use eBay. But we've got standards. We have rules. Silas nodded emphatically, stepping forward and puffing out his chest, his ghostly tweed suit glowing a soft, incredibly inviting blue. He recognized the delicate negotiation taking place and leaned into his role as the sanctuary's self-appointed warden. I personally oversee the decorum of the establishment, Arthur, Silas stated, his voice radiating absolute, unquestionable authority. I demand a strict schedule of quiet hours. Any excessive noise is met with localized freezing. Furthermore, there is no one else currently in residence who appreciates the structural integrity of a proper fireplace. Your expertise in solid fuel management would be highly valued. We have a Tudor kitchen that could desperately use a man who understands draft control. Arthur looked at Silas, absorbing the absolute certainty of the ghost's words. He blinked his pale eyes, the terror slowly receding, replaced by a tentative, fragile spark of hope. A proper fireplace, Arthur whispered, with real coal? The finest spectral anthracite, Silas promised smoothly. Arthur stood up. His movements were stiff and slow, the bones of his manifestation popping with ethereal echoes. He reached down and physically placed his hands on the brass handle of the scuttle. The moment his ghostly hands gripped the metal in earnest, claiming it not as a trap but as baggage, the aura around the metal flared brightly. A thick, heavy tether of orange, dusty light snapped from the lip of the scuttle directly to the center of Arthur's chest, binding them together in a brilliant flash of magical energy. Okay, Arthur whispered, his voice gaining a fraction of actual weight. He looked at Rhea, offering a small, crooked smile. Okay, girl, let's go. But I'm not sitting next to the toff in the car. We took the train, Rhea said, immensely relieved. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a thick, black, industrial-strength rubbish bag she had brought up with her. I'm going to have to bag the scuttle, Arthur. Just to get it past Mum. She won't let me leave with one of Grandad's antiques without an argument. Arthur nodded, stepping back to allow Rhea to carefully slip the heavy brass scuttle into the opaque black plastic. As soon as the metal was obscured, Arthur's form vanished from the attic, instantly pulled into the localized pocket dimension of his anchor within the bag. The heavy, nostalgic cold of the attic vanished with him. Well done, Rhea, Silas said quietly, drifting toward the floor hatch. A masterful negotiation. You appealed perfectly to his practical sensibilities. Thanks, Rhea grunted, hoisting the heavy, awkward shape of the scuttle into her arms. It weighed a ton, the brass cutting into her forearms through the plastic. Now, we just have to get this past my mother and get back to Gloucester before... Rhea didn't finish the sentence. As they headed downstairs, the plastic bag thumping awkwardly against her leg with every step, Rhea couldn't help but feel a fleeting sense of accomplishment. They had done it. One more ghost saved. One more tether accounted for. One more lost soul added to the sanctuary. But as she reached the bottom step of the staircase, stepping back into the brightly lit, chaotic hallway where the smell of cardamom and packing tape still warred for dominance, she froze. She paused, her foot hovering over the floorboards. The air in the hallway had changed. The ambient heat of the house, the warmth generated by Mira's frantic packing and the central heating, was gone. In its place was a cold that was entirely different from Arthur's nostalgic chill and utterly distinct from Silas's atmospheric pressure. It was a sharp, biting, surgical cold. It was the cold of a void. Baz was standing at the entrance to the kitchen, a towel draped over his shoulders, his face completely drained of colour. He was pointing a trembling finger toward the front of the house. Mira and Sala were in the living room, oblivious, arguing over the proper way to wrap a lamp. Rhea slowly turned her head, the heavy brass scuttle slipping slightly in her grip. She looked at the heavy UPVC front door. The top half of the door featured a large pane of frosted, decorative glass, designed to let light in while preserving privacy. The glass was rapidly icing over on the outside, a thick layer of unnatural frost spreading across the pane in seconds, blocking out the grey daylight of the street. And pressed squarely against the centre of the frosted glass, melting the ice just enough to leave a perfectly clear, terrifyingly distinct mark, was a smudge. It wasn't a trick of the rain. It wasn't mud. It was a handprint. It was too large to be a normal man's hand. The fingers were impossibly long, the palm unnaturally wide. It was pale, pressing against the glass with a terrifying, silent pressure. Beside Rhea, Silas materialized fully, his blue light turning instantly violent, casting jagged, terrifying shadows against the cardboard boxes. The tether at Rhea's chest burned like a hot coal. The man from the train hadn't lost their trail. The silencer hadn't been deterred by their escape. He hadn't just followed them to the village. He was standing on the front porch. Publisher's note from Gordon King, The Threshold. Trembles. Thank you for reading the thrilling continuing story of the Hollow Threshold book, 3 Part 1. As you can tell, Book 3 is a massive, sprawling epic that takes us from the chaotic attic of 42 Cooper's Road all the way back to the frozen mud of Roman Britannia in 70 AD. Because of the immense scale of this story, it has been split into 3 distinct parts to ensure the pacing remains tight, the dread stays palpable, and every phantom gets their due. The next instalment. Part 2 is coming very soon. You won't have to wait long to see who is turning that frozen doorknob. Part 3 will arrive just after that. Ready for release. All of the books are completely finished and ready to go. We are simply preparing them to be uploaded here for you guys. Join the Sanctuary community. If you enjoyed this installment, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Your interaction helps support the Sanctuary and keeps the supernatural entities from completely destroying Mrs. Pigeon's Victorian plasterwork. We want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments section below what you would like to see happen in Book 4. Which ghost's backstory should we explore next? Hold on to your iron nails and salt pouches. The next chapter is just around the corner.